Welcome everyone to our 2021 PWS Family Conference presented by Soleno Therapeutics. Before we begin today, let's first thank our amazing sponsors, Soleno Therapeutics, Levo Therapeutics, Harmony Biosciences, Radius Health, Infrasaga Pharma, Saniona, Consonance Therapeutics, and Novo Nordisk. Their support has allowed us to make this conference free for all of our community members, and we are incredibly grateful for their contributions and support. To introduce our first session of our annual family conference, I would like to turn you over to FPWR CEO, John Walter.
Thank you, Susan. And I'd like to add my welcome to all of you on the phone listening in. We have an exciting week planned of sessions that I hope you've taken a look at and have registered for and participate in. And today we're going to hear from our research team, and I'd like to introduce them. Theresa Strong, our Director of Research Programs, Lauren Schwartz Roth, responsible for behavior and mental health programs, Jessica Bahanovich, Associate Director of Research Programs, Lisa Matasevic, our PATH Coordinator, Caroline Verana Diaz, our Research Project Coordinator. They're going to talk to you today about some of the things that we're working on that we believe are positioning us to help with the advancement of trials and to help you in your day-to-day activities with your loved one. Thank you, Susan. And I'd also be remiss if I didn't thank our sponsors as well. Thanks to all of them. This presentation is being brought to you. With that, I'll turn it over to Theresa Strong.
Thank you, John. Very excited to be here. I do wish that we could be together in person, but happy to talk about the last year. There's been some exciting developments in the field. There's a lot of reason, a lot of enthusiasm. Despite the pandemic, the research has plowed ahead, and we're really grateful for that. And we're excited to tell you about that a bit today. Susan, next slide, please. So this is a diagram we use to depict the drug development pathway from research and discovery on the left-hand side, which is identifying targets that can be treated through preclinical development, which is testing drugs or gene therapies, for example, in cells and animal models of PWS, through the clinical trial process, phase 1, 2, and 3, and finally into the post-approval stage. So when a therapy has been approved and we're trying to make sure that it is being applied to the population in the way that is optimal for our loved ones with PWS. And FPWR has built programs to try to accelerate things along this entire pathway. So, and that's what we'll focus on today, is sort of the bottom half of that diagram, some of the work that our research team is doing themselves to move things forward. So we do have a very active grant program as well. And we're fortunate in the field to have some really excellent scientists and clinicians who are doing PWS research. And, you know, it's really important to support them in their work and support their work financially, and that's our grant program. But today we'll focus on those positions that FPWR is uniquely positioned to advance. For example, the registry and resources that all of the scientists and clinicians in the field can use. But I will mention, we will be talking about our grant program later in the week. Next slide, Susan. Again, this is where most of our funding dollars go, is to support research around the globe that advances PWS studies on everything from identifying new targets for drug development to through clinical trials. In fact, the first clinical trial of DCCR, Soleno's drug that is now completed phase 3, was supported by FPWR probably 5 or 6 years ago. And all the way through to optimizing clinical care. So the grant program supports research across that entire spectrum, and we'll talk about the outcomes on Thursday when we have the research roundup, because last week, on the next slide, we had a 2-day scientific conference. And during that scientific conference, we discussed many of the projects that are ongoing with FPWR support, and the investigators themselves provided an update on that. Next slide, Susan. And so on Thursday, we'll talk about some of those research projects that we've supported and the outcomes of those projects in the research roundup. But for now, we're going to, again, focus on those things that the FPWR research team is advancing. And our first speaker in that respect on the next slide is Lauren Schwartz Roth. She is a clinical psychologist and, importantly, mom to Emma, who has PWS. And Lauren has been involved with FPWR really since its first days and has worn many hats. But in the last few years, she's worked with our research team, focusing on advancing the behavior and mental health programs that FPWR is coordinating. So I'll let her speak about that.
Thank you, Theresa, and welcome to everybody. Again, as Theresa said, I wish we were all in person, but I think this is a good second option, and hopefully we can all be together next year. Next slide, thank you. I'm going to talk about, as Theresa mentioned, the behavior and mental health programs that FPWR has been focusing on over the last year or so. And the first project I want to talk about is the PWS Mental Health Guidebook. And this is a project that we did last year, and it is available currently for download on our website. And I'll be talking in more detail about this project tomorrow at a session at 1:15 Eastern Time. But just briefly, I want to tell you a little bit about the project. The guidebook is based on interviews with caregivers whose loved ones have had mental health challenges, and I also interviewed PWS mental health experts. The guidebook contains information about the ways in which people show mental health struggles, especially aspects that might be unique to the syndrome. It has information about some of the early warning signs to pay attention to and how to get treatment, the benefits and challenges of medications and non-medication approaches as well, and some resources and coping tips for parents and caregivers. And as I said, you can access the full guidebook on the website, and I hope you all will join me, those who are interested, for the session tomorrow to hear more about this project. Next slide, please. So social skills is an area that many children and young adults with Prader-Willi struggle with, and there are many challenges that the person with PWS has to really contend with to make developing good social skills that make developing social skills difficult. They have to deal with hyperphagia, neurocognitive issues, emotional regulation difficulties, and motor planning challenges. In the last few years, there's been some excellent research that has helped us gain a greater understanding of the specific issues people with Prader-Willi struggle with. So we've created some tip sheets that summarizes this research for parents. And these tip sheets focus on early play skills and how to improve those for young children with Prader-Willi syndrome. And this is important for cognitive development, and also how emotion recognition and processing of faces and voices may be different in PWS and may impact social skills. These recent studies highlight potential targets for the development of new interventions focused on improving social skills and connections for our loved ones with Prader-Willi syndrome. And the tip sheets should be available soon on our website. And our goal is to create a quick and easy way to access these recent research findings. And the tip sheets also include some suggestions for parents in terms of how to incorporate some of these recent research findings in ways to help your child be more successful in the social arena. Next slide, please. A new publication has come out regarding defining behaviors in Prader-Willi syndrome. As parents, we know that explaining the symptoms of Prader-Willi syndrome can be a challenge. When we talk about anxiety or hyperphagia, we as parents know what we mean, but often teachers or healthcare providers may not fully understand exactly what the experience is. This can also be a challenge for clinical trials and for regulatory agencies like the FDA. Again, when we talk about anxiety or we talk about rigidity, we as parents really understand what this means, but others may not. So we gathered a group of expert PWS researchers and clinicians from the Behavior Outcomes Working Group of the International Prader-Willi Clinical Trials Consortium to write a paper to address this gap in the literature. Now, this wasn't just any paper. This was a multi-year project involving top PWS experts worldwide to create consensus definitions for common PWS behaviors, which are likely to be the targets of clinical trials. And you can see those behaviors listed at the bottom of the screen: hyperphagia, temper outbursts, etc. So you might ask why this is important. Well, in order to design the best treatment studies and trials, there must be consensus and consistency on how we are defining the behavior that the treatment is aiming to improve. And this paper, we believe, provides benefit for clinical trials and is a crucial step in facilitating meaningful trial protocols to test treatments for Prader-Willi syndrome. The paper was recently published in the Journal of Neurodevelopmental Disorders and is free online. So take a look and see if the definitions and descriptions ring true for your loved one with PWS. We also have a blog about it on our website, and you can see the link to the publication there as well. Next slide. So this has been a really hard year, or hard 20 months, I think, for many parents with the pandemic. And it's been especially challenging, I believe, for parents of children with special needs. Since parenting a special needs child is a marathon and not a sprint, we as parents need support and coping tools, not only for our kids, but for ourselves as well. So FPWR has recently funded a treatment study being conducted by an excellent research group who has experience working with families with children who have rare genetic conditions. This study will test a telehealth intervention for parents. So this is nice. You don't have to drive anywhere. You can do it from your own home on the computer. This study will use evidence-based treatment strategies that will be modified to address specific concerns and stresses of PWS parents. And this is the first time a study like this will be done, just focused on PWS. This study will look at impacts on parent coping and well-being, as well as PWS child coping and behaviors outcomes. So stay tuned for more details. This study is slated to start in early 2022 with opportunity to participate for parents. Next slide. We know that individuals with PWS can struggle with anxiety and temper outbursts. And I want to talk about a few studies going on right now focused on treating these behavioral challenges in PWS. The first one is a remote study looking at the usefulness of mindfulness as an intervention for people with Prader-Willi syndrome. For those of you who've heard me speak before, you've heard me talk about this study. It's been going on for a few years. They did have some kind of pauses in the study related to COVID, but they're back on track now and still recruiting. A little bit of background about this. Several years ago, there was a study done on a very small group of adolescent boys with Prader-Willi syndrome using a specific technique in mindfulness called soles of the feet. And this was found to be very effective in reducing temper outbursts and other behavioral challenges. So this study being conducted in Australia is a larger study examining that, as well as impacts on anxiety. And even though it's in Australia, you can participate because it is remote, and the investigators are quite lovely, have lots of experience with Prader-Willi, and will be very accommodating if you're interested in participating. So you can contact Lauren Rice if you're interested in more information, or you can go to our website and find the link to learn more about participating. Next slide. And looking ahead to 2022, in addition to the parent intervention study that I discussed earlier, there are several other issues we want to be focusing on. One is to develop a plan to explore neurobiology and cognitive challenges in Prader-Willi syndrome. And there is ongoing kind of behind the scenes planning for a project in US to investigate the use of vagal nerve stimulation to address emotional outbursts and other behavioral challenges in PWS. Some of you may know that there's been a few small studies in the UK showing that VNS to be potentially highly effective approach for addressing behavioral challenges in PWS. And we're going to keep working on bringing this trial to the US in 2022. Next slide. And I want to just finish up by talking about two ongoing clinical trials that you'll hear more about tomorrow that are funded by FPWR donor support. So these are great examples of your money at work, the money that you raised to fund projects. And is actually true of all the studies I've talked about today, are all based on funded by donor support. So these two studies are focused on children and young adults with PWS. The outcomes are behavior outcomes, and they both take place in New York. And briefly, Dr. Singh is studying guanfacine, which is an FDA-approved medication for ADHD in the general population. And he will be doing a clinical trial examining the impact to treat temper outbursts, agitation, and skin picking in Prader-Willi syndrome. And Dr. Eric Hollander is examining CBD-V, which is a version of CBD, and looking at impacts on appetite, behavior, and other aspects of social interaction in Prader-Willi syndrome. Both studies have had some delays in starting because of COVID-19, but are back on track and recruiting now. And there are several more studies in addition to these that you can hear about tomorrow during the clinical trial session at 11:30 Eastern. So I encourage you to attend that, and I hope to see some of you there. Now I want to pass it on to Jessica Bohanowicz, who is the Associate Director of Research for FPWR and expert in all things registry. She'll be talking about the projects being conducted within the Global PWS Registry. So Jessica, take it away.
Thank you, Lauren. Good morning, good afternoon, depending upon where you are, to everybody. We are excited to share some updates about the registry. This will be useful for information for perhaps those of you who have never heard about the registry before, new to us families. Maybe those who created an account. We're hoping this will encourage you to come in and update some surveys or start completing surveys. And for those of you who are active participants, we want to thank you and provide information on the types of data and information that are coming from the registry so that we can encourage you to continue participating. Next slide, please, Susan. Thank you. So a brief overview and highlights of the registry. This is a web-based database, comprehensive database. It is designed basically to capture all of the information of everybody with PWS globally. And there's a number of goals that are associated with that. By having all of that information in one centralized place, it allows us to better understand the full spectrum of PWS. Everybody's experience is different. There are a lot of similarities, but there are also some individual differences among individuals and among families. It can help us support and expedite the completion of clinical trials. So for those of you who are in the registry, you may have perhaps received a notification that there may be a trial that you are eligible for, depending upon the inclusion-exclusion criteria for that trial. So the registry can kind of serve as like a matchmaking dating service where trials can provide us information of the types of people that they're looking for, and then we can forward that information along to families who then can make their own independent decision as to whether or not they would like to participate. Understanding the full spectrum of PWS can also help us identify areas of needed research and treatments, perhaps questions that, anecdotal evidence that's coming through on Facebook, but we can actually go and do a deeper dive into data within the registry to see what the numbers actually show. All that can help guide standards of care. By helping us be able to define or describe what's working best for families, what may not be working best for some families. And the overarching goal here, as always, is to improve the lives of all the individuals with PWS as well as all of their families. And we like to kind of relate the registry as kind of like a quilt, whereas there are some similarities, but everybody's story is individually different. And in order to really be able to understand PWS, we need every single patchwork on that quilt to be represented. And your story is a piece of that quilt. So if you, like I mentioned, if you have not joined the registry, we hope after this presentation you will consider doing so. We'll provide information on how you can contact us. And if you are a part of the registry, we hope that you will come in and update your information so that we have the most current information. Next slide, please. So we do want to give a little bit of an update on progress so far over this past calendar year to date. So we are really excited to report that we've had a large growth. We've had over 200 new participants join the registry. We've had over 8,500 new surveys completed. And for those of you who are part of the registry, you may know, there are over 40 surveys within the registry. It is very comprehensive. It covers all aspects of Prader-Willi syndrome, everything from birth history and pregnancy and early diagnosis, developmental milestones, all the way through into all aspects of Prader-Willi syndrome, endocrinology, GI issues, orthopedic issues, behavior, general well-being, and topics that relate into adolescence and early adulthood. We have 63 countries represented within the registry. The majority is definitely within the United States, followed by Canada. What we have done, excited to see, is that there seems to be a broader representation of ages within the registry. When we first launched in 2015, for the first couple of years, the ages of participants within the registry were skewed really young, age 10 and younger. And we are excited to see that there is a broader distribution of ages represented within the registry. It's important to make sure we really understand what PWS looks like throughout all stages. And then that last panel just kind of shows a breakdown of the genetic subtypes that are within the registry. Next slide, please. We are excited to say that there have been 3 publications using registry data in the peer-reviewed literature in this year alone, past year alone, which is fantastic. Some of these were spearheaded by our own research staff in-house. One of them is a collaboration with an external research group. So this first one here, characteristics of the behavioral challenges for caregivers within families with PWS. That paper came as a collaboration within the Clinical Trials Consortium, which is managed by FPWR. And really the goal of that paper was to document the challenges that families are facing as they care for their loved ones with PWS. We're very familiar with a lot of those challenges, but we want to make sure that those challenges are documented in the peer-reviewed literature so that the FDA and other regulatory agencies, as they're going through the process of evaluating drugs for approval, can really appreciate what families are facing. The second paper is the largest report on strabismus and other vision problems within the PWS community. This was spearheaded again internally, and it, as I mentioned, documents the largest group of data reporting on strabismus, and is a valuable resource for families to understand the age of onset. What is the most common age of onset? What are some of the other vision problems that families are experiencing? What is the frequency of people requiring to have surgery to correct their strabismus? And the recurrence of needing additional surgeries after the first surgery. And then the third paper was an examination in collaboration with Sue Kim's research group, spearheaded by Annalise, looking at the frequency and some of the risk factors associated with suicidality in Prader-Willi syndrome. And the good and very interesting outcome of this paper is that the numbers of suicidality in PWS are very similar to that in the typical population. So it doesn't seem that individuals with PWS are necessarily at higher risk, but it does seem that some of the indicating factors, some of the risk factors, some of the early warning signs in PWS may be slightly different than the general population. And that's an important distinction for us and for families and for mental health care workers to be aware of, so that we can best take care of our loved ones and reduce the risk of that type of event. And I do want to add that all of these papers are available in what's called open access, meaning that they are all available free. If you were to Google search the titles of any of these papers, you could read the full manuscript, which we're excited to be able to offer to family members, so that you can have this resource and you can also share them with members of your care team. Next slide, please. In addition to peer-reviewed papers in the medical literature, we also are really trying to make sure that we're diligent in providing data back to the community on a more frequent basis. So we are continuing to provide infographics back to the community. You may have seen some of these in newsletters or in emails. We do send them out to participants within the registry as well. If you are not receiving these, you may just want to go into your registry account and check your contact preferences. You may have indicated that you don't want to receive any communications at all, in which case you are not receiving any infographics, nor are you receiving any information about possible research studies or clinical trials that you may be eligible for. So if you're not receiving any communications and you would like to, just go in and check your contact preferences. If you have any questions on how to do that, let us know and we can help you with that. But a couple of the infographics that came out this past year, one was highlighting gastrointestinal issues in Prader-Willi syndrome, specifically with a focus on what's called gastroparesis, which is delayed gastric emptying. And what the numbers in the registry show is that it's fairly common in PWS. This is an important concern because this is what can lead to things like constipation and if untreated, blockages, which can at some point, if serious enough, require surgery. But this infographic highlighted the frequency of gastroparesis as well as the age of onset, and then a description of the types of gastrointestinal surgeries that people with PWS within the registry are having. The second infographic shown here was focused on thyroid issues. The good news here is that the vast majority, over 94% of people within the registry, are seeing an endocrinologist, which is fantastic. There is a frequency of approximately 20% frequency of thyroid issues within Prader-Willi syndrome. And of those who are reporting a thyroid issue, it's almost always hypothyroidism, which is too low thyroid levels. It's a hormone within the body. And that, once identified, can be treated with medication. So again, this is just information that we want to make sure that we're providing back to the community based upon what you are providing into the registry yourself. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the goals of the registry at the front end, these are just some examples of ways that we are working to achieve all of those goals. We are using the registry to help develop better endpoints to understand better endpoints for clinical trials within Prader-Willi syndrome. We are using registry data to help understand and develop better standards of care. Looking at some of the projects ongoing right now are looking at the scope and quantity and types of psych medications that are being taken by individuals with PWS. There's a new survey that is going to be coming out in the next month. Keep your eye out for that. That is going to be a follow-up initial questions on the use of feeding tubes in PWS. But we have a collaboration with a group of clinicians who are really interested in dialing down into understanding what types of feeding tubes are being used, when they're started, when they're ending, and most importantly, what types of complications families are experiencing with different types of feeding tubes, in order to make sure that we can maybe provide information to families and clinicians as to how to best navigate that process. Lisa's going to speak with you next about the Path for PWS study, which is a part of the registry. It's a study within the registry, which is targeted at understanding these types of serious medical events in Prader-Willi syndrome. And then we are also using the registry, as I mentioned, as sort of that matchmaking service to support lots of clinical trials and research study recruitment, and some examples of those are listed below. And all of the images to that right there are just, we're so thankful and so grateful for all of the industry partners, the National Organization of Rare Diseases, NORD, Critical Path Institute, those are both nonprofits that focus on data analysis and in rare diseases. PWSA as well, who is helping with recruitment and support of providing information and education about the registry. All of these partners interested in receiving data, looking at data, and helping to support and grow the registry. Next slide, please. So I'll end there. If anybody has any questions, as I mentioned, if you are new and you would like to know more about the registry and how to get involved, if you perhaps started an account or you don't remember if you did and you don't know your password, or if you need step-by-step instructions on how to come back in and maybe update some of your surveys, we hope that you will reach out to us with any questions. And I'm going to pass it on to Lisa Mattisbach, She is the coordinator, as I mentioned, for Path for PWS, which is a sub-study within the registry, and she's going to provide some updates and data coming out of that project.
Thank you, Jessica. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, I'm going to share with you a bit about the Path for PWS study. So PATH, as an overview, is a 4-year non-interventional prospective study that began in October of 2018. We enrolled over 650 participants with PWS age 5 and older from the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. In this study, again, which is housed in the Global PWS Registry, we ask respondents to complete surveys every 6 months. And in those surveys, we collect data about serious medical events, food behaviors, other typical PWS behaviors, and food security. We're currently in year 3 of the study and going strong, with over 92% of the participants still actively engaged in completing surveys in the Global PWS Registry. Next slide, please. In the study, respondents are asked to document serious medical events, and those are defined as events that require significant medical care, including hospitalization, urgent care or ER visits, or acute psychiatric care. And so we started to look at what kinds of events are occurring and how often they're occurring. As of September 2021, you can see 37.6% of the total participants have a documented serious medical event, for a total of 368 events. Of those, over 40% have had multiple events since the start of the study. And of those with multiple events, 21% have had more than one serious medical event in a 6-month time span. So it is clear that our population of loved ones with PWS are experiencing a number of medical issues that we want to understand better. As we begin to look at the types of medical events occurring in the PWS population, we see mental health events in the older population as the most commonly reported, followed by gastrointestinal events, which account for the second most common type of reported medical event, accounting for 16.8% of the total events. We also see a number of documented broken bones and sprains and seizures, and the remaining portion of medical events are a smattering of all kinds of different things. Next slide, please. So let's talk about what we have learned. In these surveys, again, we ask questions about hyperphagia, which is an unrelenting hunger experienced by those with PWS. We also ask about food security measures and collect data on height and weight, as well as a number of other things. So by collecting this data, it allows us to see how behaviors around food change, how body mass index and food safety needs change over time across the population, so not just in one age group, but all age groups over the age of 5. This is especially important as we've entered an age where clinical trials are readily available and treatments are undergoing review by the FDA. So now we have data to support what we live with every day. Using these survey tools, we see that the hyperphagia increases with increasing age, but the scores do vary widely. On an average, when a person with PWS is experiencing more hyperphagia, families are putting more food security in place in an effort to reduce food access for the person with PWS. We also see a trend for those with higher hyperphagia scores to have a higher body mass index. And before the end of the study, we're going to take a deeper dive into this and look at this information more closely. Next slide, please. We also looked at the use of polypharmacy. So polypharmacy is the use of multiple medications to treat the same indication. We specifically looked at the drug category, including behavior and psychiatric medications, and broke it down by age categories: 5 to 10 years, 11 to 17 years, and 18 and older. And a few things stand out. First, it's not uncommon for a person with PWS to be prescribed more than one behavior or psychiatric medication. Approximately 33% of children in the 5 to 10-year-old age group are taking at least one medication for this indication. And we see this increasing with age. In the adult population, approximately 65% are prescribed one or more medications for behavior and mental health needs, and as much as 25% are taking 3 or more medications. Next slide, please. We then broke down the behavior and psychiatric medications into categories, and again, assessed by age group. The children in the 5 to 10-year-old age group are more commonly prescribed medications for ADHD or focus and alertness. And then in adulthood, we see a change to the type of medications prescribed, with behavioral and mood medications accounting for the majority of prescriptions for behavior indications. Based on the number of medications prescribed, combined with the percentage of serious medical events documented, it's clear that behavior and mental health needs remain a challenge for our families. Next slide. So I want to talk about what comes next. So from this information we've been gathering, we've launched 2 new projects as a result of our quest to learn more about these hunger issues in PWS. First, we are conducting a study of hyperphagia variability in adults. So as I mentioned earlier, the scores on some of the surveys vary widely in adults, and we want to understand this more. So our goal with the study is to understand how the food behaviors change over time, as well as to learn more about caregiver impressions of hyperphagia in adults. We will be conducting interviews of caregivers to adults with PWS to accomplish these goals. This study has been IRB approved, and results will be published at the conclusion of the study. Secondly, we've launched a survey in which we will collect data on the food behaviors in those without PWS. And you might ask why that is. So our goal with this new study is to establish a baseline data in the typically developing population, age 5 and older, that can then be used to compare food behaviors of those without PWS to food behaviors of those with PWS. So we believe this will prove useful in identifying what may be statistically significant for an indication of hyperphagia, which again is important for these clinical trials. FPWR does intend to publish these findings and will share back to the PWS community, researchers, and pharmaceutical companies involved in clinical trials for PWS treatments. So look for more information in your email about these things and on social media in the coming weeks to learn how you can help advance this research. Or you can always email me at info@pathforpws.com. Next, I would like to introduce Caroline Verona Diaz, Research Project Coordinator for FPWR, who's going to be talking to you about a really new, exciting group called the PWS-CLIC. Caroline?
Thank you, Lisa. As she mentioned, my name's Caroline and I'm the Research Project Coordinator for FPWR. So today I'm going to talk to you about a recap of a really exciting meeting that we had last week of the PWS Clinician Investigation Collaborative, which I'll refer to as the PWS-CLIC. So the mission for the PWS-CLIC is to improve the clinical care for people with PWS across their lifespan through collaborative investigation and evidence-based clinical research. So we're very excited about this new collaborative, and I'm really excited to talk about the aim. So the first aim is to establish evidence-based standards of care across providers. And we think this is a really important aim because we want every single person, at least in the United States and Canada, no matter what provider you see, we want everyone with PWS to have the same high quality standard of care. So we want these clinicians and these care providers to really work together to figure out what's the best standard of care for people with PWS. The second aim is to improve access for people with PWS to more easily become involved in clinical research. So this collaborative's really trying to look for how to break down barriers of people with PWS so that anyone that wants to be involved in clinical research and clinical trials can do so. And the third aim is to foster collaborations. So we really want clinicians and clinical researchers to work together to think about new research questions to ask, to think about new investigations so that we can move both research and care in the field of PWS forward. So as I mentioned, we had our second annual PWS-CLIC meeting last week. And one of the most exciting things that I think came out of this meeting is that we had 27 PWS expert clinicians come together from 3 different provinces in Canada and 18 different states in the United States. So we had a great group of expert clinicians come together last week and just had a great collaboration and new connections being made with all of these different experts to talk about PWS care. Next slide, please. So here are a few takeaways that we found from this meeting. So as I mentioned, I think the most important part of this meeting is that we really had a great group of experts. We had 27 PWS experts come together to discuss how best to optimize clinical care. So a few updates were presented from ongoing CLIC projects that started last year, and I'm going to highlight 2 different projects that we think are very exciting. So the first one is that we had a very large working group within this CLIC group work to improve care by standardizing the recommended tests and labs conducted. And this is a really important project because we want to make sure that no matter what provider your loved one with PWS is seeing, even if they don't happen to be a PWS expert, we want them to have the same level of care as everyone else. So with this project moving forward, we'll be able to say, here are the specific tests that need to be run on someone with PWS for this specific age group. And here are the labs that you need to order for this specific age group. And so we really want to be able to improve care by making sure that everyone across the United States and Canada, at least at first, getting the same labs and tests run for the standard of care. And the second project that Jessica had mentioned earlier is a really exciting project on feeding tube use and complications. And so for this project, we had a group of clinicians that really wanted to know what type of feeding tubes are people using, when are they getting implemented, when are they stopping using feeding tubes, and then what type of complications with the different feeding tubes are we seeing. So as Jessica mentioned, this feeding tube survey is going to be implemented in the global PWS registry within the next month. So we'd really appreciate you taking this survey because that's really going to help this PWS-CLIC group to look at best standards of care for feeding tubes and potential complications that people need to look for so that we improve the standard of care around feeding tube use in the future. And then our last takeaway from this meeting is that we started a discussion on clinical trials, because currently some ways that clinical trials are being implemented is relatively inefficient. So we started talking, and all of these clinician experts in PWS started discussing how if this group could potentially improve the efficiency of recruiting and running these clinical trials. So we had a very exciting meeting last week where we're really excited about the work that's been done so far, and we're looking forward to all of the great work that's going to come out of this group in the future. So with that, I'll turn it back to Theresa, who's going to talk about Genome Project and our advocacy efforts.
Thank you, Caroline. We'll just wrap up with a couple of projects that are near and dear to my heart, one on genetics and one on research advocacy. So the first one is a project that we're piloting this year that we just got started earlier in the spring, using whole genome sequence analysis to better understand the severity of symptoms in PWS. So we know that there's a lot of variability in what symptoms people get that are associated with PWS and how severe they are. For example, seizures occur in about 25% of our population. Hyperphagia occurs with varying degrees of severity. And the question that we're asking is, are there DNA variants outside of the PWS region that might be influencing that? And can we use that knowledge to help families in the long term understand what their specific risks are of having different symptoms and severity associated with these different aspects of PWS? And this information might also be useful in understanding what drugs are going to work better for what kids and what side effects might be a particular person with PWS might be more at risk for. So, we're looking at this as a multi-year project. And in this first year, we're really sort of getting the logistics up and going. So on the next slide. So we're doing this project remotely. We're using the power of the registry and all of that information that has that information about these symptoms that is stored in the registry. So we have about 50 families that have been recruited. We use Zoom to do consents. We sent them a blood collection kit, and then they sent the blood off to a company, PerkinElmer, to do the whole genome screening. We're collaborating with the University of Alabama at Birmingham to do the bioinformatics analysis of those DNA sequences and pair the DNA sequence with the symptoms from the PWS registry. you know, one of the most important things about this whole process is that we want to be returning results to families in a way that is responsive to their needs and what they want to know about, and is also responsible. And so we've put in place some ways of getting information about pharmacogenomics, about if there are variants of DNA of significance that are clinically significant outside of PWS that pop up in these families. We have ways to provide that information in a responsible manner. So this year has really been about just getting that process up and going. And honestly, it's been going really smoothly. We have, you know, more than 40 families enrolled already, and we have more than 30 sequences done. And we really appreciate everyone who's been very enthusiastically advancing this project. So look for this project to be expanding in coming years. On the next slide, the other thing that has been really exciting this year is that we're in a position that we've not been in the PWS community really ever before. We have two drugs, Soleno's drug DCCR and Levo's drug carbetocin, that have completed phase 3 clinical trials. They've had positive results generally. But the FDA is now reviewing all of their data to see if it meets their standards for getting a drug approval. And part of a really critical part of that process is letting the FDA know the needs of our community. So we've been working on this for many years, and collaborating with PWSA, collaborating with all of you, and working through the PWS Clinical Trials Consortium to build a body of information that the FDA can use in these kinds of decision making. So the 21st Century Cures Act, which was passed in 2016, really formalized the process of incorporating the patient voice into this decision making. And so we've been working to gather information about what is the unmet need in our community, what is the impact of PWS, what are the treatment preferences? Like, we all know that, you know, we'd like to see hyperphagia treated, and we'd like to see anxiety treated, and we'd like to see sleepiness treated, but the FDA doesn't, you know, necessarily know that. So we've been working with all of you. Many of you have participated in our various surveys, and we really appreciate that, so that we can gather a sort of a community-wide assessment of the needs of the community and share that with the FDA, and share things like what would be a meaningful impact of a drug, how would that improve the lives of our loved ones with PWS. So on the next slide. We've been working to gather all that information. Here's a number of publications, several of which that have just come out in the last year, based on, again, the participation that all of you have done in some of our surveys, so that we can share, and we've shared that information with the FDA so that the FDA has a good understanding of the needs of the community as it goes into these regulatory decision-making activities. And those are coming quickly on the next slide. And we're going to talk more on Friday about how you can make sure that your voice is being heard, that your perspective on PWS is shared with the FDA as they are making these regulatory decisions. There is a FDA advisory committee meeting coming up in early November for Levo Therapeutics drug. And there's some opportunity to, again, have your voice heard about that, but we want to do it in the most effective and impactful way. And that's what we'll be discussing on Friday. So we hope that you'll join us for that. So that was a bit of a whirlwind tour of some of the activities that the FPWR Research Team is doing to advance research in PWS. We would love to answer your questions about that. And again, it's just a sort of a sprinkling of the many activities that we're doing. So we'd be happy to discuss anything. And you can contact us individually, or of course, we'd be happy to answer your questions now.
Thank you so much, Theresa, and the entire FPWR team. We do have a number of questions that are coming in, and I just want to make a quick reminder for all of you that if you do have questions, please use the Q&A control panel. Questions do tend to get lost in chat, so having them come in through Q&A allows us to go through them as best we can. There may be some questions that are outside of the scope of today's presentation, and we will do our best to respond to you individually if that's the case. So let's go ahead and get started. Going back, perhaps, Lauren, to your presentation in regards to soles of the feet. For families whose loved ones are not eligible for that study because they're too young, are there any places to find guidance or resources so that they can perhaps implement that program?
That's a great question, and I do think that it can be helpful even for younger children. The protocol per se from the study isn't published, but there are some, and I'll put a link in the chat. There is one website that lists out some of the steps for soles of the feet, so I'll put that in the chat after I'm done talking. But another strategy that I think can be helpful, especially for young children, is there are some online apps like the Calm app or Headspace that have mindfulness interventions specifically for children. And so that might be a place to start. They're short and they're fun. And so I would encourage you possibly to look at some of those resources as well.
Fantastic. We have a couple of questions in regards to the registry. Jessica, how often should individuals go to the registry to complete their surveys?
Sure. So we definitely recommend that you come in at least once a year, scan through all of your updatable surveys and just see if anything has changed. So the vast majority of surveys in the registry are what we call updatable, meaning that when you come back in, you will see they will repopulate with the answers that you provided previously. And you can just sort of, like I said, scan through and make any changes. You don't need to start from scratch. It's designed to kind of live as a living medical record, a continuous living medical record. There are a handful of surveys that are what we call longitudinal, meaning that every time you open them, they are empty. But those are usually set on a 6-month schedule or whatever schedule they're set on. You should be receiving a reminder when it's your turn to retake that. The other time we would suggest you come in is when something happens. You know, if there's a serious medical event, a new surgery, a new diagnosis, a medication change, something that just kind of sparks your memory that something happened. Maybe after you see your physician is a great time to come in and update your surveys because you have all of those reports and records and everything in hand and you don't have to hunt them down. So at least once a year and more frequent depending upon the number of medical visits, doctor's visits, and or diagnoses and things that are going on in your family.
Great. And is there an age requirement for participating in the registry?
Absolutely not. It's from the day of birth and on. And we actually are very fortunate. We even have families who have joined after their loved one has passed away and have, perhaps it's a sibling of an adult and maybe they don't remember everything, but every piece of information that they provide is valuable. You don't have to come in and know every single thing. Like I said, there's a lot of surveys in there and you may not know, especially if it's a sibling of an adult, you may not know the birth and early childhood history, but any piece of information that you can provide in any single survey is a data point that can be used.
Great. And if someone's not sure if they've already registered or not in the registry, how could they determine if they're in there?
They can reach out to me and or to Lisa and we can help you search. If you provide us your name and email address that you may think you would have registered with, or the name of your loved one or a date of birth of your loved one, we can look in that way. We do ask if you are not sure, please contact us before creating a new one under a different address, because then we end up with duplicate accounts that we have to go in and curate, because having multiple data points for the same person actually skews the data and can make things a little bit messy. So we do ask that if you're not sure, please ask us and we will help guide you through that process.
And what about researchers? If they're interested in using registry data, can you give us a high-level explanation of how they are able to do so?
Absolutely. So we have the registry, which I did mention in this particular talk, but the registry is an IRB approved study. IRB stands for an Institutional Review Board. which basically is an oversight committee that makes sure that research studies, clinical trials, any clinical trial that you may have ever participated in or research study is IRB approved, anything that involves human subjects, to make sure that the data is being collected and used in an ethical way, and that the participants within the registry, their privacy is protected, things along those lines. So it's an oversight. The registry is an IRB approved project. And as part of that approval, the registry established a governance board, an advisory board. And that advisory board is composed of members from the community, including academics and some clinicians, as well as families, some parent representatives, and representatives from other PWS groups. And that board is tasked with reviewing applications that come in from clinicians. So if a clinician or a drug company or any other outside entity requests de-identified data, I also want to be clear that if their request is approved, they receive de-identified data, meaning that anything, names, birth dates, living locations, anything along those lines is removed from the data set. It's scrubbed from the data set before it is provided to an external source, to an external entity. But those applications are relatively detailed. Researchers have to provide us what data they're looking for, why they want it, what they are planning to do with it, and how they're planning to report the results back to the community. And then that application is reviewed by this advisory board and approved or denied.
Fantastic. Lauren, let's talk a little bit more about the mental health guidebook and perhaps some other parts of your talk. At what age does mental health become an issue? Who should be attending tomorrow's session? And when should they be downloading the guidebook as a reference? You're on mute, Lauren.
Sorry. From the interviews that I conducted, most of the individuals started to show some more serious mental health issues around early adolescence, so around age 11 or 12. The criteria for being in the study were people who had a loved one with Prader-Willi over the age of 10 who had mental health challenges, but most of the folks in the study had those challenges sort of appear over the age of 12. So I would encourage anyone to attend tomorrow's session who's interested in this topic, who may have some concerns. I think if your kids are really young, it's probably wouldn't be helpful, but if your kids are 10, 11, 12 and above, I think it could be helpful. You can, a lot of what I'm going to talk about will be in the guidebook. You can download it today and bring it with you, or you can do it after the talk, whatever is would be most helpful to you. I'll be going through a lot of what's in there, but not everything. There's a lot more than I can put in a 45-minute talk. So. And I'd also encourage people to share the download with, family, healthcare providers. I also created kind of a one-pager that's on the website that could be really nice to share with a healthcare provider, just kind of the high points of what to look for.
Thank you, Lauren. I'm seeing a number of questions coming in about how people can get more information about a particular clinical trial or more information about particular studies. For all of you, if you go to FPWR's website, we do have a clinical trials directory. So in the main navigational menu, there will be a link that says clinical trials. If you go there, you will find the contact information for all of these studies, as well as some information and a contact to reach out to should you have more information about participating in those trials.
And I'll just mention, Susan, that you keep that very up to date. So, people should refresh that as new clinical trials open, as new sites come online. Susan's updating it regularly. So it's good to go back and take a look.
Can I just say, I noticed there's a number of questions about the mindfulness study. I don't know if one of you has the link you can put in there to the study, but there's information on our website if you put in PWS and mindfulness, and then Lauren Rice is the researcher who's doing that study, so you can also find information online, and we'll put it in the chat once one of us finds the exact link. But it's a really good, I actually participated in the study with my daughter, and it was really a great study. And I think we learned a lot, and it was helpful for both of us.
We have an individual representing a group home here today. She's asking if individuals who reside in group homes are eligible to participate in any of the studies.
Yeah, I mean, off the top of my head, it is pretty much study by study. And so I think we just have to go through the criteria for each study. Certainly the things like the mindfulness, I would think, Lauren, that is, you know, those kinds of behavior studies likely could have participants. And then with respect to the drug studies, it really has just varied. And, you know, in some cases, the companies have found it easier to have people who are not in group homes so that, you know, they're certain that the same caregiver is coming each time. But if there's a caregiver commitment, you know, that is something that perhaps can be discussed. And I guess I would say with any clinical trial, you know, you'll see the inclusion and exclusion criteria, but there's also usually a study coordinator to call, and it's worth calling and just asking those questions and you know, talking through some of the aspects of it.
Great. Another question regarding registry participation. This mom feels that her daughter is not typically developing, even for Prader-Willi syndrome. Is there still benefit to having her participate in the registry? Is her data still helpful?
Absolutely.
So Jessica and I know we're both going to say the same thing. You go ahead. I mean,
no, go ahead. Go ahead. I mean,
yeah,
like I mentioned at the first slide, every single story is incredibly valuable because everybody's story is different, and we can't understand the full scope and the full spectrum, or what is typical or what is not typical without everybody's story. And I think I'll let Theresa speak more a little bit about how this relates to what she was speaking with about the Genome Project.
I mean, we know that, you know, there are some kids, even when we do everything, right? When we do every intervention and, you know, do every environmental thing that we can do, they still really struggle. And, you know, I think it's really important, for them to be included in that data so we can really understand the full spectrum. Again, kids that are struggling, kids that are doing really well, like, you know, both ends of the spectrum. We really want to have an understanding of that, because the needs of both of those groups is similar in some ways, but there are probably a lot of differences. As an organization, we want to make sure we're serving the needs of everybody. But from a scientific standpoint, you know, one of the questions we have is, are there other genetic changes in a child who is really struggling that we can identify that maybe could help that family, you know, navigate, you know, this path a little bit more smoothly. So I think, yeah.
And I was going to say, to Theresa said, we often hear the opposite from families who are like, well, there's, you know, my child's doing really well. Like, I feel guilty almost that my child isn't really having any problems. And so I don't want to be in the registry because it seems like I don't have anything to say. Like, that's important. That is also equally important to gather.
Absolutely. We're going to have one more, we have time for about one more question here. We had a question about Tourette's. Has there been any connection between PWS and Tourette's? Do we have any information about a co-diagnosis?
I have not seen any report of that within the registry.
Yeah, and we do have
of that specific one. Yeah.
Yeah, we do have kids who have got more than one thing going on. You know, just because you have PWS doesn't mean that you don't have something else going on. So it's certainly possible, but I don't think, I think it's a rare finding. But again, those rare findings are sometimes, you know, give us a lot of information as well. So it'd be great to have that information in the registry.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for sharing this information, answering so many of these questions. Just as a reminder, we have this wonderful match taking place currently. I've placed the link into the chat. If you would like to share that, we would love to be able to maximize this opportunity. Please mark your calendars. These are our dates for 2022. We will be in person. Chicago, here we come. We will have our PWS Research Symposium. This tends to be a research audience, but families are more than welcome to attend. This will be September 29th and 30th, followed by our annual family conference, September 30th and October 1st. And new for this year, we're going to also host a Live Life Full Gala Saturday evening at the House of Blues, Chicago. So look out for more information in the new year. We hope that you will all be able to attend. And before we get going today, just a little reminder about some of the upcoming sessions. We had a lot of questions today about clinical trials, eligibility, what different trials are. I highly recommend that you all join us tomorrow at 11:30 Eastern for our clinical trials update session. We have presentations from 6 different clinical trials that are either currently recruiting or will be recruiting soon. So if you have questions about clinical trials, please join us for that session. Later today, standards of care for people with PWS. If you're curious about how you can provide better care for your loved one, join us for that session at 1:15 Eastern time. And at the end of the day today at 3 p.m. Eastern, we'll be discussing physical activity for people with PWS. I don't know about you, but I have a challenge getting my son out and active. In this session, we'll be giving you some research-based information about how you might be able to provide additional activity opportunities for your loved one. Not to forget, this Wednesday, we have a really special session provided by Let's Go Fitness and brought to you by Levo Therapeutics. It's going to be a really fun family workout. Dante Johnson is a 16-year-old boy with Prader-Willi syndrome. Over COVID, he has worked out 200 consecutive days. He's lost 50 pounds, and he's going to be providing a workout for us Wednesday evening at 7 p.m. Eastern. The whole family is welcome to join, so come join us for that. And finally, very, very important session for you all, Friday at 11:30 Eastern. As many of you may be aware, our first potential treatment for PWS in more than 2 decades is currently under review by the FDA. As part of this review, the FDA is holding an advisory committee meeting, and we have the opportunity at that meeting to provide our input and ensure that our voice, the voice of our community, is heard by the FDA. So in this session, advocating for new treatments for PWS, we'll be discussing the upcoming meeting, what the committee will be reviewing, and how the PWS community can participate and impact that decision. So we highly encourage every member of our PWS community to register for the webinar. A recording will be made available, so if you can't attend it live, you'll have access to watch the presentation later that day. And in that follow-up, you'll receive instructions for how you can provide your comments to the FDA. So make sure that you have made note of those really important sessions. We hope that we'll see you later today, as well as later this week. Thank you for joining us.